We've talked about this subject in here before. We talked about it a number of years ago, and due to, I think, its timeliness, I'd like for us to touch on this subject again. For our scripture reading, we heard a passage from the book of Deuteronomy. And the background of that passage is that back several books earlier in the book of Exodus, the Hebrews had left Egypt under Moses. They were on their way to live in the promised land, but they displeased God along the way, and because of that, they were left to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. When we get to the book of Deuteronomy, the time is fast approaching when they will actually be able to enter the promised land. And before they do that, they are reminded that the way things go for them in the promised land will depend upon whether or not they follow God's commandments and the ways of life God has prescribed. And so we have several chapters in the book of Deuteronomy that remind them of that. If you want things to go well for you when you get into the promised land, you must follow the commandments of God. And what we heard earlier as our reading was a part of that. Now there's one part I want us to especially look at. God is speaking here, and it goes, "Therefore you shall lay up these words of mine in your heart and in your soul, and bind them as a sign on your hand. They shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall teach them to your children, speaking of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up." Now this is one of the places in the Bible where it talks about raising children. Now the Bible does not talk a lot about raising children, but it does speak of it in several places. And when it speaks of it in the context of teaching values to the children. Interestingly enough, everywhere the Bible speaks about raising children, it speaks of it in the context of the parents. And so we are left with the impression that the Bible intends for the parents to be the primary ones to raise the children, and the parents are the ones responsible to instill the values in their children. And I want to keep that in mind while we think about something completely different. Go back into American history. I want us to look at several changes in American society. We're going back 201 years to the year 1820. In 1820, there were only 21 states in the United States. It didn't go any farther west than Missouri. All the area of Texas and Arizona, Nevada, and California was Mexican territory back then. A man named James Monroe was president. I've heard that name before. I couldn't tell you a thing he ever did. That's how long ago it's been. There was no electricity, no plumbing, no central air conditioning, which we have been so thankful we have this week. No cars, not even trains back then. No telephones, no radio, no TV or internet. Life was simpler back then. Daily life was harder, but it was simpler. In 1820, 90% of all Americans lived on farms. 80% of all American workers were farmers. That means only 20% were not farmers. Of the 20% that were not farmers, the great majority of those were employed in what is known as the artisan system of labor. Now, the artisan system of labor refers to an economy where most goods produced in that economy are produced by hand in small shops, by craftsmen. Artisans were people like furniture makers, blacksmiths, shoemakers, pottery makers, basket makers, harness makers, and stuff like that. Where we live in Bellwood, a number of you have been to our house, but we live on Old Bellwood Road. The reason it's called that is because we live just about a quarter of a mile from where the old square of Bellwood was. Half the road is gone now that used to go on up through there, but there used to be a harness shop down there where they made harnesses And there used to be a place down there where they made shoes. And so that was the artisan system of labor. At that time, most people who were not farmers were what would be called craftsmen or artisans. And most of their workshops were self-owned, and they were located either in the house or adjacent to or very near the house. And so that means that the overwhelming majority of Americans worked at home or very near their house. And at that time, approximately 90% of all Americans were self-employed. That's hard for us to imagine today. 90% of Americans were self-employed. Think about that. Only 10% of Americans worked for somebody else. There's something else interesting in 1820. Most children received their education from their parents. There was virtually no such thing as the public school system. Education was for only the upper crust of society. For everybody else, if you were lucky, you might live in an area where there was a Sunday school nearby, and children might receive some of their education there. Sunday school began in the late 1700s. It did not begin as a religious thing. It began as a basic educational thing to teach children to read and write and do arithmetic. That was the original purpose of Sunday school. It was held in churches because in a lot of communities that was the only public building available. They used the Bible to teach children to read from because in a lot of places that was the only book people had. It was on Sunday because that was the only day people had off. Back then, children did not lay around and play soccer and stuff like that all the time. They worked. They either worked on their farms with their fathers and mothers, or they worked in whatever trade their father worked at, or they helped their mother during the day. Sunday was the only day available, and so for a few hours on Sunday, they'd be taught the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic. So here's the pattern of life in the United States of America 200 years ago. 90% of people lived on farms, 80% of people were farmers. The remaining 20% that were not farmers, most of those were artisans and craftsmen. 90% of Americans were self-employed. Children did not go to public schools. They were at home during the week. They were with their parents during the week. They received what education they got from their parents, or maybe they received a little at Sunday school. That's 1820. If we go up 130 years to 1950, less than 20% of Americans lived on farms. Less than 12% of American workers were farmers. And so in those 130 years, we had gone from 90% being living on farms and 80% being farmers to less than 20% living on farms and less than 12% being farmers. America was now an urban nation. The artisan system was long gone. It had been replaced by the factory system of manufacturing. Only 25% of Americans were self-employed in 1950. And so in 130 years, we went from 90% being self-employed to 25%. By the 1950s, most American workers were employed by someone else in business and industry. Most children were receiving education in the public school system. Every state had compulsory attendance laws. In the early 1900s, most compulsory attendance laws required attending public school till age 14. But by the 1950s, it was generally going to age 16. In 1910, only 9% of Americans had a high school diploma. In 1950, over 55% of Americans had a high school diploma. That was due to the public school system. And then we move up to today. Less than 1% of Americans live on farms. Less than 3% of American workers are farmers, but that's inflated because it includes people that are full-time employed somewhere and just farm a little on the side. Today, only 7% of Americans are self-employed, and today 90% of Americans have a high school diploma. So look at what happened from 1820 to today. We went from 90% of Americans living on farms to less than 1%. We went from 80% of American workers being farmers to less than 3%. We went from 90% of Americans being self-employed to just 7%. We went from children receiving most of their education from their parents to children receiving their education in public school. Think about the impact that had on children. If you were a child in 1820, chances are overwhelmingly that your father was a farmer. If he wasn't a farmer, he was probably a blacksmith, a furniture maker, or something like that in a small shop. If you were a boy, chances are you worked with your father every day, helping him either in his craftsman shop or on the farm. If you were a girl, chances are you worked on the farm, and when you weren't doing that, you helped your mother with her chores in the house. You were with your parents all day. That gave your parents tremendous influence on you as you grew up. They were the major influences in your life. You lived alongside them every day of your life. You were raised by your parents every day. You learned from them. They were the ones who instilled the values in you, the values that you would hold as an adult. In 1950, if you were a child in the 1950s, chances are you did not live on a farm, you lived in a town. Chances are your father was employed in business and industry. He left home in the morning and came home in the evening, and you were in school all day. Chances are, though, when you came home from school, your mother was there, because at that time, most women did not work outside the home. Your father was largely removed from your life, except for a few hours a day. And your mother was largely removed from your life. She may be there a couple hours more. You see, most of your life would be lived apart from your parents. The move off the farms into the cities, the move from self-employment to employment in business and industry, the move to public education changed the role of parents and completely changed what it meant to be a parent. By 1950, the father was, for all practical purposes, a negligible influence on his children, and the father was seen primarily as the one who made the money for the family to live on. Because of the public school system, the mother's influence had been greatly reduced, and the children spent most of their time with others. Today, 82% of mothers with children under age 18 work outside the home. That represents a huge change in the way the family operates. First, the father was taken out of the home. Now the mother is taken out of the home. The result of that is that children are raised by others. They spend much more time around others than their parents. Compare the amount of time children would have spent around their parents growing up in 1820 to the amount of time they spend around their parents today. And even the time they spend around their parents today, from the people I've heard talk of, is not really spent around their parents. It's spent around them going to soccer practice or swim practice or something like that all the time. Now add in the influence of things like TV, movies, the internet. All those things have a huge influence on children. Children are raised today by others, and others form the values in children, with parents having only a peripheral influence in their children's lives. Most importantly, though, parents have lost control over their influences that the children are exposed to. Parents have no control over what is taught in the public school system. They have no control over what is on TV or the internet or the movies. This popular joke notion of limiting my child's screen time is a cop-out. The fact is that parents have lost control over their influences the children are exposed to. They have lost control over the values their children are taught. You see, withdrawing the influence of the parents and replacing it with the influence of the public school system, TV, movies, and the internet has led to seismic changes in the values and attitudes society holds. They have led to huge changes in the values and attitudes individuals hold. Many of the seismic changes we have witnessed in our society over the last few years would have never been possible if the influence of the parents had not been negated and the influence of others had not been primary. Many of these seismic changes we have seen in society would not have been possible without television, the internet, and the public school system. Children are taught these things are good. They are portrayed on TV and the internet as good. They have grown up being taught and being conditioned over and over and over again that these things are all right. Now, some people think these changes are good. Other people think the changes are bad. Some people are happy things are moving in the direction that they're moving in. I remember 40 years ago, over 40 years ago, when I was at Chapel Hill, a professor made the remark that it's a good thing for children to no longer be raised by their parents because we don't like the values that parents are instilling in children. We want to instill our values. And they did. And look where it got us. I hear mostly from people who are not happy about the direction things are going, and they lament that the younger generations do not hold the same values and attitudes that were held dear in the past. We need to keep in mind that the younger generations did not just invent the values they hold. They did not come up with these values on their own. They were taught them. Who taught them? Others did. First the father and then the mother were removed, and there is never a vacuum. Something will always fill a vacuum. With the father and mother out of the picture, other influences moved in. It was only with the father and mother out of the picture that these other influences could move in. In our modern industrialized society, parents found new ways to earn more money and have a higher standard of living for their children. They did not, however, figure out a way to do that while at the same time passing the values on to their children. The quest for a higher standard of living took parents away from children and necessitated them turning the raising of children over to others. And these others instilled values into children that are counter to the values that children in a healthy society should be taught. You see, the higher standard of living that we all enjoy today has come at a tremendous cost. It's a cost all of us are paying, not in financial terms, but where it really matters. I recently read a book that details an epidemic about suicide among middle-class white men. The suicide rate among middle-class white men is many times higher than among any other grouping of people. And it's only in the United States. It's not in Germany or France or Britain or Sweden or Africa or the Middle East or anywhere else. We have an epidemic of suicide among middle-class white men in the United States of America. We also have an epidemic of drug abuse among middle-class white men in the United States of America. I don't know if you all know this, but you can get on the Sheriff's Department website and look at the arrests of the week. And you look on there, and you look at all those people arrested for methamphetamines and heroin. Nobody does marijuana anymore. That was our generation, you know. Nobody does that anymore. It's methamphetamines and heroin, man. But they're white men, middle-aged white men. You see, part of the cost of the standard of living we all enjoy today is that in our quest for a higher standard of living, we neglected to pass values on to our children. We neglected to do it. We look out and we see that the upcoming generations of today do not share the values and attitudes we have. The reason they don't is simple. We didn't teach them. We gave them a higher standard of living and turned the raising of them over to someone else. And the result was that the values that they were taught are not the values that are required for a healthy society. I could not help but think of something Jesus said. You cannot serve two masters. You cannot serve God and wealth. How is a culture, a lifestyle, a certain set of values maintained? It is maintained only if it is passed down to each succeeding generation. It cannot survive if it is not intentionally passed down. I want us to go back to the book of Deuteronomy. Remember, it's right before the Hebrews are going to finally enter the promised land. And the book of Deuteronomy is sort of a review of what's happened over the past 40 years, and then warnings about the next part. In chapter 4 it says this: take care and watch yourselves closely, so as neither to forget the things your eyes have seen, nor to let them slip from your mind all the days of your life. Make them known to your children, and your children's children, how you once stood before the Lord your God at Horeb. In other words, for their society to continue, their culture, their values, their beliefs, their customs, their outlook, what defines them as a people, has to be passed down. Take care and watch yourselves closely, is what God tells them right there. They didn't do that. And here's what happened. After the death of King Solomon, which biblical scholars think occurred sometime shortly after the year 1000, the Hebrew kingdom split in two parts. From that time on, everything was constant turmoil. In about the year 725, the Assyrians conquered the northern part. In about the year 590, the Babylonians conquered the southern part. The Hebrew kingdom was gone. What they once had was lost. And it was never recovered. Never. It was never recovered. You know, sometimes things have consequences we don't foresee and don't intend. For all the advantages of modern life, for all the advantages of the standard of living we have today, and all the conveniences and luxuries and stuff, there was a big downside. We lost the ability to pass our values on to the next generation, and parents lost control over the influences that their children are exposed to. They lost control over the formative years of their children. Modern life came upon us, and it seems so good, and it moves so fast. And we never really stopped to think about the cost of modern life. We saw the benefits of it, but we didn't see the downsides. One of the major downsides is that parents lost control over the values their children were taught. So what do you do about it? My mother used to have a saying that I think is true, and I've learned this as I went along the line. There's a price to everything. Changing it will require sacrifice. You can't have your cake and eat it. Somewhere or another, we have to decide what's really important. And only then will there be change.